And I'm going to start, as I often do, with telling you about the next webinar that's coming up in 2 weeks. And we are going to have a presentation by an attorney named Jeff Montpettit. And Jeff is an attorney who represents plaintiffs in a number of wrongful death type situations, among other things. And he's one of the few lawyers who's really active in a lot of the child welfare issues in terms of bringing litigation on behalf of people, including grandparents and other surviving relatives of children who have been killed in foster care. And so he was the attorney that represented the relatives of Kendrea Johnson, who some of you may remember was a 6-year-old foster child who committed suicide in around 2013, and is also representing the grandparents of Ariana Hunsaker, who was similarly killed in foster care. So the big issue, the interesting issue here is that for many years, since 1989, there's been a Supreme Court case that virtually gave sovereign immunity to social workers in counties where there was a wrongful death. So if there was malpractice or there was just neglect, then you really couldn't sue them. But there was a recent Supreme Court case in the last few months. It was based on the Eric Dean situation. Eric Dean was you may remember, was a 6-year-old who was killed. And I'm going to leave it up to you, by the way, to admit people, Stephanie. He was killed by his stepmother, and that precipitated a whole series of reforms in child protection and a big task force that the governor put together. So it's a big case, a visible case that people still talk about. And the state Supreme Court really changed for the first time the kind of rules that they came to allow litigation against people, counties and social workers in the child protection arena, as opposed to foster care, which has always been possible to do that. So it may be a potential game changer. So he's going to talk about what you can and can't do legally, where litigation is possible, what's going on in that world, and some of the changes that are coming about or potentially coming about because of this major state Supreme Court decision. So that's Jeff Montpettit in 2 weeks. It should be pretty interesting. And so please tune in. And this week, we have Kirsten Christopherson, as Stephanie said, and her 2 colleagues, Tom Hesse and Michael Molnar, who are going to talk about the upcoming state legislative session. And they are, as she will tell you, experienced people at the legislature who will give us a big picture view of what's going on. We're not going to talk a lot about the specific issues that relate to child protection, foster care, but more, the big picture issues that are going to be in the newspaper. So I'm just going to say that much about it. I'll leave it up to you, Kirsten, to introduce yourself and your colleagues. And then as Stephanie mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie and Rich. Thank you all for the welcome today and for the invitation today. I'm so excited to share my team with you, and we're excited to be here today. So I'll just do kind of a brief introduction of our team. So I'm Kirsten Christopherson, president of Christopherson Advocates. With me today is Tom Hesse and Michael Molnar, and I'll let them do kind of a brief introduction of themselves. Our bios, I think, are on the invite today. So if you care to read about us, please do. We'll just do kind of a brief intro about us. About our backgrounds. So I'll say just about myself that I've been an attorney for about 20 years, went to St. Thomas for undergrad, went to the U of M for law school. I've been practicing law until very recently. I started my own shop and got to create my own team. Yeah, and we have one other colleague too, and he's not with us today, but I get to share my team with you today. And so we are a government affairs only shop. So while I've been an attorney for almost 20 years, we do not practice law. We only do government affairs. And our firm consists of these colleagues today who will tell you about themselves. They've Tom Hesse and Michael Molnar have been involved in politics for a number of years in different capacities. But we come together as a government affairs only shop, and we serve primarily nonprofits. So we're really honored to work with you all on the legislation that we're working on this year. And I wish I could see you all in person. Maybe someday I'll meet you all in person, but this is what we have now. And so we'll present to you today like this. But really, I have very personal reasons for wanting to work with nonprofits. We have about, I think, 20 clients, most of whom are nonprofits. I think we have 2 small businesses. And so my heart's really with nonprofits, and I can tell you more about that some other time if I meet you in person. But that's what we work on, and we're really proud of our track record. With that, we work on a number of policy issues. We've passed a number of policy issues, and we really work on a lot of appropriations bills, including bonding bills. And we'll talk about bonding later on today. So without further ado, I'll kind of pass things off for a brief introduction about backgrounds for Tom and Michael.
Thanks, Kirsten. My name is Tom Hesse. I joined Kirsten's team, a year and a half ago or so. And I have, as just doing a lot of the finance and, kind of behind the scenes things for Kirsten, also do just general public policy consulting for her. Have my own consulting firm as well, which I help a multinational company with their 50 state regulatory and legislative tracking. So a whole bunch of little things here and there that in the public policy world that I help them with.
Thank you. I'm Michael Molnar. I'm honored to be here. I've been with Christopherson Advocates for just over a year now. Prior to that, I worked for the House DFL caucus. I had two roles there as legislative assistant, working for many members of the House DFL team, and then most recently as a committee administrator, working for the Jobs and Economic Development Committee and the Labor Committee. So working with the chair mostly, putting together an omnibus bill, deciding what bills to hear. It was a fantastic job. I loved every minute of it, but been really enjoying my time working with Kirsten and Tom. And so I guess I'll throw it back to you, Kirsten.
All right, so we'll get right into it. I would say, you're here today to learn about the legislative session and kind of get an overview, and that's what we're excited to tell you about. So I thought I'd just do a brief overview of kind of the governor, the House Speaker, and kind of the Senate Republican caucus, the majority leader, of what their top priorities are. And then I'll tell you how we're going to break it down briefly into our topics, and my colleagues and I will cover some things for you, and we'll open it up to questions for you. So that was kind of our thought on that. And I made some notes of things that I thought might be of interest to you for what's going on here for the legislative session that just started a couple days ago that we're excited to be working on. So Minnesota, as Tom will dig into in a few minutes here, has a $7.7 billion budget surplus. I mean, just unprecedented amount of money that we're dealing with this year. So I'll jump right in with the governor, Governor Walz. I'm sure all of you know is a Democrat. Things that he's emphasizing this year. He's talking about lowering healthcare costs, and by adding a public insurance option this year to MNsure marketplace. So that's something that's important to him. He wants to create a paid family and medical leave program and put funding towards tackling the costs of for vulnerable adults and childcare. So that's something that Governor Walz is really emphasizing. He wants to create checks for frontline workers. I'm sure you've heard about, some people are calling them Walz checks, or they want to propose the idea of Walz checks, and replenish the unemployment insurance trust fund, issue and tax rebates, one-time tax rebates for Minnesota. So he wants to also make sure that the state's budget reserves are flush. So those are things that he has been emphasizing, the governor, who again is a Democrat. I'm sure many of you know that. House Speaker Melissa Hortman, also a Democrat, has been emphasizing economic security in her comments to the public lately, just prior to the session beginning. She's been discussing frontline worker bonus pay as something that's important to her and to her caucus, paid family leave program, tax cuts for middle and lower income residents are something of top issues for her. She wants to spend on early childhood through higher education across the board, she's mentioned, and she wants a $100 million plan dedicated to violence prevention and law enforcement. And I'm going to use air quotes here, best practices. And we haven't heard all the details about what best practices are. I think Michael's going to touch base on both areas of, he's going to touch base on public safety and election year politics, but all of the caucuses and all the bodies are talking about public safety as an issue, and we haven't heard her best practices yet. So finally, she's also discussed $1 billion proposed issue of climate change. So she's really pushing climate change. Now moving over to the other side of the aisle, we have Republicans. And our new Senate Majority Leader is Jeremy Miller. And I say new, many of you probably know that our former Senate Majority Leader is Paul Gazelka. He's running for governor. So we've got a new Senate Majority Leader, business person, Jeremy Miller, fresh face. He's been around the caucus for a while, but he's putting forth his priorities, and he's really emphasizing cuts, tax cuts for lower and middle income people, and those on a fixed income as his caucus's priorities. He wants to repay the state's debt and potentially lower unemployment insurance and have tax rates for small businesses. And the Senate Majority Leader wants to support recruiting and retaining law enforcement. He's really been pushing that actually for a few months now. And finally, he's discussed proposals to improve literacy, he says, from a young age. So we've got some things that you see that are overlapping and some things that are quite a bit different. So we'll see how that plays out. And these are just, of course, broad brush comments that they've all been making leading up to session. And, session just started a couple days ago, and it's constitutional end is at the end of May. So it's a short session this year. And so we thought, as our plan, we don't want to take up a lot of your time today, but so we thought it would be good to break things into major areas that we thought might be of interest to you. And those major areas would be the budget, which Tom will take, and public safety, and election year politics, which Michael will take. And then I would end up with bonding. Don't know how interesting bonding will be, but what Michael's going to talk about with election year politics and public safety kind of tie into bonding and the fact that it's a bonding year. So hopefully that will be of a little interest to you. And then we'll end with any questions that you might have. So those are the major priorities of the Democrats, the Republicans, the governor, who's a Democrat too. We are one of the only states in the nation that we have divided government. So that makes things pretty interesting. So Tom, you're going to kick us off with the budget overview and then pass it off to Michael. Tom, go ahead.
Thanks. And as Kirsten mentioned, the state is lucky enough to have a $7.7 billion budget surplus for the remainder of the fiscal 22-23 biennium. It's really quite amazing given what has happened to the economy with the pandemic, that we can have this level of surplus at the state level. I'm going to take a little bit look at how we got to this point, and then where we're going, and then maybe talk a little bit at the end just about what to look for in the coming months. So I think we got here by economists probably underestimating the resiliency of Minnesota's economy, or the national economy generally. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to predict economic activity when you've never lived through a pandemic and shutting down sectors of the economy. But what we found was individual income tax, corporate income taxes, sales taxes all significantly outperformed what economists thought would happen just in February of last year. So the November forecast that was released, found we had $5 billion more projected revenue coming into the state for this next 2-year budget period than we previously thought. So, while it's certainly great news that we have the surplus, there's still some risks that are identified with the forecast that the state talked about. Obviously, the pandemic's high on that list. How is it going to go? They probably didn't see the Omicron variant back in November, picking up steam like it has. So that could have some negative implications for state revenues as we go forward. Inflation, when we looked at inflation back in November, most people thought it was going to be relatively short-lived, transient, as they said. Now it seems to be the consensus. It might be a little longer lasting and a little higher than people expected. So that'll be an issue. Labor force participation really hasn't bounced back as a lot of people thought. So that's along with supply chain issues that kind of creates some supply chain issues. We don't have enough people to drive trucks. We don't have people to do a variety of tasks that are inhibiting goods coming to market. So all of that are sort of the risks that we have out there for the next forecast that really the legislature and governor will use to figure out, okay, what do we really want to do with that 7.7 or whatever $7.7 billion or whatever dollar amount it will be when the February forecast is released. We have a year and a half left of the budget period. So again, there's a lot of things that can happen in that time frame. So we have to be somewhat cautious given the uncertainties that are out there, but there's still plenty of money around for the legislature to fight about. So what do we look like right now? In January, Minnesota found out that we had another little positive surprise, $833 million of additional revenue that came in November and December that wasn't previously forecast. Some of that's due to some timing issues, people taking advantage of some federal tax changes that paid state taxes early to qualify for that. So it's more of a shift than an ongoing stream of revenue, but there's still some that's ongoing. And again, it'll bump up that level that the legislature has to fight about. The U.S. When they released that economic update, they did say that just in the last 2 months, economic growth estimates for the national forecast are all down from 2022 to 2025. Inflation is revised up. So again, there's a lot of this stuff could have some impact on what the final budget numbers are that the governor and the legislature will have to deal with. Some on the positive, we've got more money in the bank right now than we had previously. But again, when you look over that, the rest of the 2-year budget period, lower economic growth, higher inflation could cause there to be some adjustments to that $7.7 billion figure. And one thing that just still surprised me when I looked through all the documents is we still have 2.3 million Americans that have left the labor force and not returned since February of 2020. And that's just a hard thing for an economy to get over. And so there's going to be some challenges with that and trying to figure out what does it take to get people back into the workforce that once were there. So finally, how does this impact the budget debates that we're going to have, kicking off here, in the next month or two? As I said, there's still going to be a big pot of money to fight about. And Kirsten laid out a lot of the priorities. A couple of them she identified, I think there's a fairly decent chance that they'll get some consensus on, and that's there's already been bipartisan support signaled for dealing with the unemployment insurance debt that the state is in to the federal government. That really would be a big positive development for employers generally. Anybody that pays unemployment insurance taxes will see the benefit if the state uses some of the surplus to help pay off that federal loan. We won't have to increase UI tax rates, add surcharges or have surcharges triggered. And so that would be a big positive for Minnesota businesses and nonprofits and others that pay unemployment insurance taxes. And the other one is those bonus payments for frontline workers. I think there's general agreement that both sides want to do something with the surplus for frontline workers. The big problem will be trying to figure out who gets what, how much. There's different views on, the broad category of, what's the definition of a frontline worker? So who gets it? How much are they going to pay? How much of the surplus will they use? But I would think there'd be some type of agreement there. And then there's all the rest. As Kirsten alluded to, Democrats do want to give some dollars back. Governor the Walz checks. They do have some ideas on reducing income tax rates as well. So there'll be one pot of money that is probably going back to taxpayers in some fashion, whether it's just a one-time payment or more permanent tax reductions. And then they want to spend on their priorities, whether it's education, healthcare, family leave proposals that were talked about. Those seem to be the broad areas, and climate change as well, that they'll be working on. Republicans, on the other hand, was already mentioned, a big emphasis on permanent tax reductions. So I think you'll see that be probably a majority of a Republican proposal will be, permanent tax reductions, give the dollars back to the people. But then, it is an election year, and this will lead into some of Michael's comments. During election years, legislators like to pass things that are good for their constituents. So so there might be some spending opportunities that will get done as well, because whether it's in education or healthcare or other areas, there's certain spending ideas that can generate positive goodwill towards candidates. So we'll just have to see what happens. There's a long way to go. The last thing I'll leave you with, though, is just to remember that last legislative session, the state passed its budget. So we do have a budget for fiscal years 2022 and 2023 on the books. So if nothing happens with all this money, the government will still function. It's not a necessity to pass any of these bills, but I think both sides will want to do something, again, because it is an election year and they'll want to run on, doing something good for their constituents. So with that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Yeah. So this is my 10th year working at the Minnesota legislature, and one of my favorite aspects of working in politics that I've always said is every session is different. And boy, is that going to be true this year. After a year and a half of everyone working remotely, the Minnesota Senate plans to do a lot of their business in person while the House remains remote. So just those two aspects is going to be fun to watch. As Kirsten and Tom have talked about, it is an even year, which is typically for bonding and policy work, but it does feel like a budget year, a really big budget year. The state, as Tom and Kirsten mentioned, we do have a $7.7 billion surplus, and everyone's going to have different ideas on what to do with that. So it'll be interesting to see what ideas are thrown out and if an agreement can be made. On top of that, it is an election year, a very big election year. Everyone who holds an elected office at the Capitol is up for re-election this November. That means everyone in the state house, the Senate, the governor, also including the attorney general, the state auditor, the secretary of state, which is one thing I'll be watching is, usually the secretary of state race is pretty tame, but added the attention with elections for some, it could become a hot topic. So that'll be one thing I'll be watching as November gets closer. To add to the fun, new district maps will be coming out in mid-February. The House and Senate, I think they gave themselves a deadline to meet an agreement by the 15th of February. Spoiler alert, that's not going to happen. So the Minnesota Supreme Court will release their map mid-February. One thing to look for is how many seats Minneapolis and St. Paul pick up, since that will help DFLers. Since we have seen over the past 10 years, more and more people move to the cities from greater Minnesota. So that is one thing to keep an eye on, as Democrats are kind of facing a little headwind for their reelection. Redistricting can also draw members into the same districts. So we do see primaries of oftentimes close members who work together, but they just so happen to be drawn into the same map. Sometimes members, they will actually move where they live. They will find a new house so they fit nicely into their newly drawn district for the next 10 years. And of course, this session, public safety is a top priority for many folks at the Capitol, including Senate Majority Leader Jeremy Miller, who said that is their top priority. A lot of people are feeling that Republicans do hold the upper hand on that argument right now, painting DFLers as soft on crime. Well, I live in St. Paul, and we have already had our 6th homicide of the year last night. DFLers have won their majorities in the House past 2 elections by winning in the suburbs, and Republicans are going to try to convince folks across the state, but especially folks in the suburbs, that they can help keep them and their families safest. DFLers in the House are doing their best to counter that argument by rolling out big public safety proposals. Just as yesterday, they had a House hearing, House File 2724, carried by Cedric Fraser from New Hope. That bill would give $40 million to community violence interruption and victim services, mental health. But it should be noted that none of that $40 million is going to police. GOP in the Minnesota Senate will definitely have a different view on how best to handle public safety. So that's kind of what I'm keeping an eye on. I'll throw it back to you, Kirsten. Take it from here.
Thank you, Michael. I think you all can see how proud I am of my team. Great job. So I'm going to just finish with bonding. I don't know how excited you all are about bonding, but I am. So I'm going to try to make bonding exciting for all of you. I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'm sure going to try. So I did think a lot about this. I thought about what would be interesting in the topic of bonding. It is an important year this year for that in this area. So what I tried to really tie in into the budget and the election politics in mind, because I knew that my colleagues would be speaking about that. And for anyone who's not familiar with bonding, it's also formally referred to as capital investment. Some of you may know it as that. So one of the ways the state pays for capital improvement projects is to borrow money by issuing bonds, which are promises to repay money borrowed for a specific time and interest rate. General obligation bonds, or GO bonds as they're called, are the primary type of bond that are issued, and they're backed by the full faith and credit of the state, by the powers of the state. So last year, as Tom mentioned, we refer to that in legislative terms as a budget year. And so we have a budget. We don't need to do anything, I guess. So you may see that happen. Nothing could happen. This year is referred to as a bonding year, traditionally speaking. To confuse things more, we could have, we do have a small bonding bill every year. Well, there was one last year, but this is our big bonding year this year. So you'll be hearing people talk about bonding. So I thought we would talk about it today just briefly. So it's my hope, and many other people hope, that there will be a bonding bill passed, or a capital improvement bill passed this year. And that's where buildings and other infrastructure can be built and improved upon. So the governor kicks things off, as he just did last week, revealing his big wish list in the form of his governor's recommendations. And he had a very large list this year. It was $2.7 billion. And that was unprecedented, as you can imagine, too. And just a little brief history, very, very brief history, going all the way back to Arne Carlson as governor. There used to be kind of a mindset. Arne Carlson, I think, was the first governor to get up to like $1 billion bonding bill. And since then, we really haven't had kind of a bonding bill bigger than that until this current governor, and we recently got up to around $2 billion. And so Walz has really pushed the envelope, just because we have so many needs around the state to improve buildings and infrastructure. So there are a lot of interesting dynamics at play this year when it comes to capital investment or bonding. And we've discussed the large surplus. Tom took us through that. And so they're all, those are mindful for everybody. There are 201 members and they all have bonding projects, capital improvement projects in their districts. And Michael touched on election year politics. And so all the 201 members, not to mention lobbyists, right? But all 201 members are going to want to vie for their projects to come home in their districts, because they're running for office again. So making things even more complex this year, the Senate has really interesting dynamics when it comes to bonding, capital investment. For those of you interested in any kind of inside baseball, the senator in charge of the Capital Investment Committee is not a Republican. In fact, he used to be the Senate Majority Leader in charge of all the Democrats. And his name is Tom Bach. He is from Cook, Minnesota. For those of you interested in Iron Range, the Iron Range, or from the Iron Range, you might know him. And his district has changed over time. And so now his politics might change as well, might be changing as well. So he is currently an independent person, and he is caucusing with the Republicans. And so he and one other member too, David Tomasoni, they are both caucusing with the Republicans in the Senate majority. And the Senate Senate Republicans in the majority, they have a kind of a small majority. And so for Thomasoni and Bach to caucus with them. They now enjoy a little bit larger, more comfortable majority. And in trade, those two members got gavels. They got chairs of very prestigious committees. So Thomasoni got higher ed, and we won't really talk about that today, but Bach got this capital investment or bonding committee. And that's a prestigious committee. Now, he does have Republican staff. So that makes everything really interesting. Think about the dynamics of that. So that's the Senate. The House Bonding Committee is run by Chair Fu Lee, and he's from Minneapolis, and he's considered by many as a real rising star. I would agree with that. He's a member of the Posse Caucus, and maybe some of you are familiar with that. That's the People of Color and Indigenous People Caucus, a very powerful group of legislators, I would argue, and currently all Democrats right now in both bodies, Senate and the House. And so the bonding bill must pass by a supermajority. So that's 41 votes in the House and 81 votes, 41 votes in the Senate and 81 votes in the House. And so neither majority party in the House or Senate currently has enough votes in their own party to do that. So they need to work with the minority party across the aisle. So working across the aisle is really key. So the last thing I'll say circles back to Tom's presentation on the budget. Every bonding bill can include cash. And so that's a big thing this year. You're going to probably hear a lot about cash. That makes what I think bonding bill is really interesting this year. So since we have such a large surplus, as Tom mentioned, many people think it's a good year to include a great deal of cash in the bonding bill. This will make things really interesting. Every bonding bill can include a little bit of cash. But this year it could include a lot of cash, or people could find creative ways to use cash in other areas. So if you are interested in the bonding bill, like I am, you could pay attention to what's going on with cash, what's interesting, what's going on with the dynamics of the Senate versus the House, the Posse Caucus, what they're interested in, how that's playing out with a prominent member of the Posse Caucus being the chair of that committee, somebody who's not a Republican being in charge of that. So a lot of really cool things at play. I'm really hopeful that a lot gets accomplished, but I think I'm ever the optimist. Maybe my clients or my colleagues will roll their eyes. I don't know. And so that's kind of what I had on the bonding bill. You can see my enthusiasm, and we just really appreciate being asked to be here today. We're honored to work on bills with you this year. I know that that's not the topic for today, but just know that we're honored to work with you. We're gonna fight tooth and nail for those. And thank you. And we can open it up for questions if you like.
So feel free, anybody, to ask questions or give a comment.
Or not.
Kirsten, could you explain to us what particular infrastructure projects you would expect to see in the bonding bill?
Well, typically, sure, that's a great question. And typically, there are roads and bridges and schools around the state. And I represent, as I mentioned, our firm represents a lot of nonprofits. And if they have more, I can get into the weeds pretty quickly, so I don't want to do that to you. But nonprofits oftentimes are included in the bonding bill. Many nonprofits are. And
as recipients of bonding proceeds?
Yes, and that's where cash comes into play this year. So not to get too much into the weeds, but typically to ask for GO bonds, a nonprofit has to be attached to a government entity. For example, a city or a county has to be what used to be called fiscal agent or local owner. And so they, for example, city of Minneapolis or Hennepin County would have to pass a resolution to receive those funds. So GO bonds come through the state, have to be granted to the local owner, and then the nonprofit can receive that and then lease it back. So again, getting into the weeds, but then the nonprofit is able to build their building, lease it back for $1, but the Hennepin County or Minneapolis would own that nonprofit's building for the length of the bond. This year is kind of a cool year if we do have a lot of cash, because there are options for, Hennepin County or any city or county, they're not wild about being local owners or fiscal agents because they've got their own projects to work on. They've got their own buildings roads, bridges, things like that, every bonding year. And nonprofits wouldn't necessarily want to be tied to them. And so if there is a lot of cash this year, there's an opportunity for nonprofits not to be tied to them and vice versa. And so you could see a lot getting done potentially with cash, and that would be a great thing. Senator Bach talked about that and maybe changing things going forward. So we'll see.
The use of cash would be instead of bonding, in effect.
Potentially, yep. Well, there would be I'm sure there will be, I can't guarantee that a bonding bill will pass, but I'm sure if one does pass, there will be debt service taken on. There will be GO bonds sold by the state, but there's always some cash in the bonding bill. But I would think if there is a bonding bill passed, there would be cash in it, and more cash than we've seen in the past.
And the bonding bill, the bonds that are issued are always GO bonds?
Yeah, that's primarily, yes, primarily the type of bond sold, yes.
And there's some other differences, like for transportation projects, there'd be trunk highway bonds. There's a mix of different bonding requirements, but the large majority, as Kirsten said, are GO bonds.
Yeah, and trunk highway bonds would be repaid out of gas tax proceeds and the like?
Correct.
Is there another question? Someone else was in the chat.
Question. You had, and maybe Tom mentioned this, it was extraordinarily difficult to forecast the budget, right? The revenue, I guess, that created the budget surplus. So what is a normal variation if you look over a longer period of time? And this seems extraordinary. And is this happening in the majority of states across the United States? Because it just seems to lead to a scramble of who can come up with the spending programs to consume this. And, and I worry about it being done, I guess, thoughtfully.
Sure. I don't know the number of states that are lucky like Minnesota that have large surpluses. I certainly could dig into that if you're interested. We've had big swings because little economic changes can have major impacts on revenue in the state of Minnesota. Personal income tax is our biggest revenue raiser, and if you think about economic activity declining, even if it's just a little bit, that and we have a very progressive income tax in the state, that can have a big impact on personal income tax revenues and collections. So, we've seen, certainly $1 billion, $2 billion surpluses previously. We've seen, $6 billion shortfalls previously. So it's, there's not really a common level of surplus or deficit that's projected. It's all just so dependent on little changes in economic activity or just random events that change the economy in ways we just didn't foresee. And I forget your last question.
Maybe it was more of a comment about just concerns about carelessness, maybe of how we all scrambled to get a piece of this.
Yeah, one of the good things in the November forecast was a large chunk of this revenue was projected to carry forward to the 2024-2025 biennium. So it seems to be, at least right now, more permanent than one time in nature. So if that stays, when we see the next economic forecast, that's probably good news for ongoing spending versus more one time in nature spending.
Might be a faulty logic or naive logic question, but with a huge budget surplus, what's the rationale for funding infrastructure with bonding, which incurs debt, versus paying for it out of the surplus?
Good question. I think we see that from time to time, and in some years, the legislature has devoted a significant amount of surplus revenue to things like roads and bridges. So that's certainly a possibility again, especially if that money is one-time in nature. If they, if it's not going to be recurring, one-time infrastructure spending is something that the legislature, I think, on a bipartisan basis has done in the past. But I think there's always, and Kirsten, you might have to chime in here because you're much more of a bonding expert than me, but I think, there's always a place to, for bonding in kind of the legislature's playbook, because you do, you have buildings, you have, that are, that, you buy your house, you pay for it over a long period of time. So when the state similarly has buildings that they're either constructing, renovating, they often pay those over a long period of time as well. Especially when rates are really low, it's it's a good deal.
But I mean, I remember at least when I was around doing some of this, that the conventional wisdom, public policy wise, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, was, you match long-term spending to long-term investments, like roads and buildings would be general obligation bonds. And, you wouldn't spend, if you take something that you would pay off over 20 years, you might not, pay for it in cash because there are, there are budget needs and that are current ongoing needs. So it seems like we've stopped following that conventional wisdom, or it's just a blip and it's not going to change things forever.
I couldn't have answered the question better than Tom. Just having been, everybody answered the questions just wonderfully. I was just up in person at the Senate Republican caucus yesterday, and some chairs of committees mentioned to me it's a good year for cash. And then on the opposite, I was Zooming and on the phone with some chairs of committees from the House DFL caucus, and they said, great year for one-time spending. So people do seem to be thinking of this in a bipartisan way. It's a good year for some cash spending. So we'll see. But there always is that idea that there could be some uses for long-term spending. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a bonding bill. But everybody's got different priorities and everybody has different ways of negotiating. Like I said, I've been a lawyer for 20 years. There are a lot of different negotiators at the table here. So everybody needs to be talking. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there are cash used in different ways. And then there's a small bonding bill, we'll see what happens. So we'll see. But very exciting. To people like us, very excited. We hope you're excited about it too, but we just hope a lot is accomplished. I first worked up at the legislature. Tom probably did about the same time too. Michael a little bit after this, but I first worked up there in 1997, and I did work for a Republican. That's who gave me the opportunity at the time. He's still up there, by the way, and we work with him all the time. If anybody wants to guess who that is, you go right ahead. I used to schedule his lunches. This was before I went to law school. I used to schedule his lunches with Democrats. And so, people work together pretty openly and in very bipartisan ways. And the gentleman I used to work for at his lobbying shop when I was a newer lobbyist, he was a tax policy researcher. Democrats used to come over and ask him for tax policy advice all the time. He was a Republican tax researcher. I am extremely hopeful. The things that I'm seeing, maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, I'm extremely hopeful for what's to come in the future, because people seem to be very polarized. Maybe they were very polarized, and Michael's certainly seen a lot in his time up there as a staffer and a high-level staffer on that, but people really do get along. And so I'm very hopeful that things can get done.
You had mentioned education being a priority. I think maybe that was on the Democrat, or maybe that was bipartisan supported as well. But do you see anything specific to the impact that COVID has had in the maybe remote learning space and deficiencies? I have seen with the lower income children I work with a disproportionately larger learning gap. And I've seen schools passing children who really would not have otherwise passed in this pandemic environment, right? And so I don't know if that level of detail you've seen surface yet in some of the money we might spend to address the education impact.
Does anybody else want to say anything about that before I do? I am concerned about education after a meeting that I had yesterday because there was an education bill passed last year. As Tom mentioned, we have a budget. We have a budget and we don't need to do anything. And as Michael talked about, we are in an election year, we're in election year politics this year. So people are kind of set. And so my concern is that if people don't start talking pretty soon, pretty quickly about things that they have in common, about these needs that they have in common, then things could fall apart. And as Michael mentioned too, we've got redistricting. So if people get distracted about redistricting, then we won't be talking about those things. So, if you have concerns and you have some facts and outcomes and things that you want to share with your legislators, I would encourage you to do that. I won't say who I had a conversation with just yesterday though. And the consensus, in the Republican caucus anyway, is that we kind of got a bill done. It was a good bill. Everybody's happy with the bill on both sides, both bodies, both sides of the aisle. It was a good bill. And so unless there are some major priorities to get done this year that we can all agree on, we're done. And so things that you're saying, I agree with. There's always more to do, but you have to get people to be talking about that and agreeing with it.
I guess the other one was crime. Is there bipartisan support around crime? Is that pretty clear or not?
Boy, Michael, do you want to talk about that? I will after you do.
I think there's a bipartisan recognition that crime is a problem, but the solution, I think they are polar opposites. I really do feel that a compromise definitely needs to be made between the House DFL and Senate Republicans if any substantial public safety bill wants to pass this year. Now, as I said, Republicans, they feel like they have the upper hand on that issue right now. It will be, and I mentioned Democrats in the House have brought bills forward just yesterday and continue to do that this week. It'll be interesting to see if Republicans in the Senate take them up on that offer or if they just want to roll the dice. Right now, we got the upper hand. We're going to go into the election. We're going to win the House. We're going to hold the Senate, maybe even flip the governor's office and use that as a big campaign issue. So that's kind of how I'm seeing public safety play out this year.
Tom, do you want to say anything on that?
No, I think Michael did a fine job.
Yeah, I will say again, election year politics might be very, very different. And I think Michael's a really good one to speak on that and did a great job. I was very encouraged last year. By some Republicans who have been around a really long time in that area and by some Democrats in the House in the Posse caucus who came forward and really did a great job, again, across the aisle in different bodies, and that really got together and worked together, and I think accomplished a lot last year. So I remain hopeful. Election year politics, I don't know, maybe could cause some change, and Michael's nodding his head, but I'm going to continue to remain hopeful.
So what would be like one or two examples of the polar opposite kind of proposals on public safety that they're bringing, that aren't like the mesh?
Michael, do you have an example you want to share?
I just think spending towards police. I know that the Democrats yesterday have the $40 million budget idea, more for community, targeted towards communities hit hardest by crime. I'm guessing Republicans will want to put that money towards police. Then I guess that's one thing. We'll see any police reform. I know they did some work on that last year, but if they will take that up again, that is yet to be seen.
So we have a question in the chat. Question: how many Fed infrastructure dollars are coming here, and who pays for what, Minnesota versus the federal government?
Good question. I don't know how much Minnesota receives from the feds from the infrastructure bill. Just not something that I've followed. So I can't answer that part. Oftentimes there are some strings attached to federal dollars where the state would have to match a certain portion of that, but again, I don't know what the particulars are in that federal legislation.
And I think a lot of it came last year, right? Like, but in 2021, we've kind of had our big, influx of federal infrastructure dollars so far. Is that correct?
I always heard during the debate on the federal infrastructure legislation that the money was really spaced out over a multi-year time frame, and it was odd because everybody thought it was meant to stimulate the economy during the pandemic, but I think a lot of it will be still in 2022, 2023, and maybe even longer.
So I have one or two questions, but let me, leave some room for other people to jump in, either in the chat box or just, just speak out. So I know you all don't focus on a lot of different areas, not necessarily human services stuff, but I just want to point out that the governor's budget proposal, his supplemental budget, has something like $225 million for one of our top priority areas, which is early learning scholarships, because essentially a lot of the money in the past has been on pre-K. The governor's pressing for more money for pre-K, but it's the period of time, the first 1,000 days of life, that are absolutely critical for brain development. So if you've got a child who's in major stress and they're in trauma, and so all of their fight and flight responses are triggered, their brains don't develop normally during that period of trauma. And if they're neglected, they're being left in the cribs and not stimulated. So early learning scholarships are now going to be open, if this proposal goes through, to children from birth to 3 instead of only pre-K. So it's, the leverage from that investment is, much better than childcare. I think many of you may be familiar. Art Rolnick who was at that time at the Federal Reserve Bank, did a study and showed something like a $14 to 1, payoff or return on investment from early learning scholarships. So we're really happy to see that amount of money. I'm thinking, roughly that will cut into the potential backlog by half. So going from maybe a quarter of the kids being served to who would it be eligible in terms of their age and their vulnerability, to a half. But it's a big number, and then 900 million over 3 years. Both of these are over 3 years for the basic sliding fee childcare program, which apparently would eliminate the wait list for that, which would be enormous. So these are big kind of one-time investments, but they would close some of these service gaps that have been sitting out there for years, and people have been advocating for years to close them. So, I mean, that's more of a comment than a question, but I just think if you have any comments on it, I'd welcome it. But those are issues that are near and dear to our heart.
I don't have any comments on that, but I did find the Minnesota receives $4.8 billion from the federal infrastructure legislation, and that's over a 5-year period of time.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I think I would just say, again, based on just a conversation that I had yesterday, I'm concerned about the area of education, early childhood education. As Michael knows, it ties into K-12 education in the Senate. They don't have equally matching committee structures and that. And so if you have facts and figures, that you think are important, contact your legislators and keep pushing for that. And I'm a big believer in that posse caucus. Just personal plug here. The people, I don't know everybody in the posse caucus. I think Michael does. But there are some really dynamic people in the posse caucus, and they're some people have been around for a really long time. Some people are just kind of, like we said, rising stars. And to the extent you all know anybody in the Posse Caucus, contact those people. People in the Posse Caucus are very shrewd negotiators in many circumstances, chairs of committees and leadership, and know how to get things done and work well across the aisle. So that may be a way to go for early childhood education, HHS needs, things of that nature, I guess would be some advice I would leave you with.
Good, and we have, and basically that Stephanie is the person who kind of connects our volunteers with those Posse community members. We've met with many of them, but I just want to say to everybody who's here, we would, and making some of those visits, regardless of whether you're representative, senator, or members of the Posse Caucus or not. So we'll be gearing up for our session activities in the next month or so, and stay tuned and hope you can participate. Well, I have one, we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I have one follow-up question left. And so if somebody else has one, just budge in line right in front of me, because I can wait on mine. But I was going to go back to Michael. I think I know the answer to this question, but you had mentioned that the DFL is facing headwinds this year, which would not make it an unusual year. But and I was thinking that maybe that's mainly around the public safety issues. But did I guess right, or are there some other obvious major things that the DFL has as challenges this year?
Yeah, well, thanks. Just right off the bat, it's long history of whoever wins. It's weird. Whoever wins the White House, which a Democrat won the White House, the following election, 2 years later, that party is going to take a hit. It's always happened. It really doesn't matter if it's a Republican, Democrat. So I think, Democrats had a great election 2 years ago, and I think there's always a little correct coming back to the other side. So I think just that alone, Democrats are facing. And then, the public safety, crime does seem to be on the rise. I think Democrats are doing their best on making it, this is a national problem, not just a local problem. Focusing, the one thing that they probably aren't going to agree on is firearms. So maybe, that's something that they can get out ahead on. But I would is just coming back from, the Biden winning the White House it always happens, is that party will take a hit in the following November. So
and there's not much of a margin for error in the House, right? The DFL only has a small majority there, and they're already in the minority in the Senate. Is that right?
That's correct. They had a larger majority 2 years ago. They lost some members. They have some retirements coming in the suburbs. But as I mentioned, redistricting, if they could pick up a couple seats in the Minneapolis, St. Paul, that would definitely help them hold their majority in the House. So that is something to keep an eye on.
Well, the hour has flown by for me. One last question. Anybody want to ask one last question before we wrap it up? Well, Kirsten and Michael and Tom, we appreciate all of your time and your experience. We will probably be in our blogs and so forth. We'll be updating people on progress. We'll talk about the bills that we have specific interest in later on in the session, one of these webinars, and watch for that info in our publication. So thank you all. We had a nice turnout today. We appreciate you all coming, and we'll talk to you all soon.